War broke out after the British settlement around the fork of the Ohio River in 1749. A financial group called the Ohio Company began colonizing the west of the Allegheny Mountains. This land was officially owned by nobody, though in fact it was already occupied by the French. The company intended to build houses, farms, and a fort, and accommodate 200 families within 7 years. The settlers would exploit the coal deposits, cultivate fertile lands, and trade with the Native Americans. Trade was expected to be very beneficial. The Virginia settlers, however, were very much afraid of the Native Americans, who slaughtered outlying British settlements during military operations. It was also clear that Quebec would not ignore the presence of the British fort on the Ohio frontier. A special committee was set up to resolve the issues of the borders between the British and French colonies. However, no solution could be found before the war broke out. Britain and France continued to occupy disputed territories without preliminary discussion. Clearly outstripping their adversary, the French built a number of forts south of the Great Lakes and in the valley of the Ohio River. Hearing of this, the British dispatched Washington to that region. Washington was to deliver a letter demanding that the French leave the region and to thoroughly reconnoiter the enemy fortifications and their approaches. His mission was a failure, and in 1754, the British began building a fort at the junction where the Allegheny and the Monongahela form the Ohio River. But the French troops soon arrived and drove them out, completing the fortification and renaming it Fort Duquesne. In May, Fort Duquesne was manned by about 1,400 regular troops and militiamen. Additionally, most Native American tribes supported the French because they developed new territories and set up farms and towns only in the St. Lawrence Valley. The forts located in the region of the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley traded with the natives and neither oppressed nor destroyed their peaceful settlements. Washington realized that the presence of a British fort in that region would serve a major political purpose and could become a bridgehead for the troops. Shortly after, he attacked the escort of a French envoy carrying a letter which offered the British a truce, provided they refrained from invading the territories controlled by Fort Duquesne. This was one of the incidents which resulted in the 7 Years' War and in 2 decades of hostility to Washington's policy. The event brought forth indignation, first in Canada and later in France. Parisian newspapers called Washington a murderer and demanded vengeance. Events in Ohio developed without regard for the Crown's position. Neither Washington nor the Virginian governor had any intentions to resolve the conflict through diplomatic negotiations. Instead, they reinforced the garrison of Fort Necessity to 400 men and sent out regular troops from South Carolina. Washington was confident he would easily repel any enemy attacks. However, when about 1,000 French and Native American troops approached Fort Necessity on July 3rd, it became clear that the fort was very badly situated. The French made their stand on the heights around Fort Necessity, and neither walls nor trenches could protect the defenders. Washington realized there was no point in offering further resistance and surrendered. An open war broke out on all frontiers between Britain and France in North America. In the winter and spring of 1755, both countries sent regular troops. Taking advantage of these reinforcements, the governor of Virginia decided to attack Fort Duquesne. In summer, about 2,000 men under the command of General Braddock moved out. In the morning of July 9th, Braddock forded the Monongahela without any resistance from the French side. As they moved along, the terrain became more and more enclosed, and when they reached a passage between 2 mountains, the French attacked. With 900 units, they entrapped Braddock, and heavy fire rained down upon his troops. The panic-stricken British soldiers fled towards the crossing, where the survivors crossed back over the river. On another part of the border, the British achieved a sudden success. According to the Peace of Utrecht, they were the owners of the peninsula where the present-day Canadian province Nova Scotia is located. To support their rights, the French built a number of forts on the isthmus connecting Nova Scotia with the continent. In summer 1755, a squad of 2,000 men moved out of Halifax and occupied all the forts on the New Brunswick Isthmus. The French garrisons, totaling 500 men, yielded to them without firing a single shot. Quebec paid major attention to the lands in the south of the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, the British not merely occupied several frontier forts, but had also secured a land corridor between Nova Scotia and the main territory of their American colonies. A bridgehead had been prepared for the attack on the St. Lawrence Valley. In the next step, Britain intended to deport the French inhabitants to other colonies such as Georgia, Massachusetts, and so on. To that end, they manned an expedition under the command of Colonel Johnson, who was in charge of more than 4,000 troops with heavy and light artillery. All the French could hold against their adversary were about 1,500 troops, militiamen, and Native Americans. As a result of Johnson's expedition, Britain was able to strengthen its positions along the River Oswego and threaten the French lines of communication in the south of the Great Lakes. 1755 was a year of war in North America. Britain and France strengthened their borders, carried out operations into stretches of the so-called no man's land, and prepared bridgeheads for future advances. From 1755 to early 1756, the French had the advantage. They transported over 8 battalions of regular troops and hundreds of recruits to Canada. They would have sent more if Britain hadn't begun its unrestricted naval warfare against the French ships approaching the shores of North America or traveling from Canada to France in the summer of 1755. Thus, on June 7th, for example, a transport squadron was suddenly attacked by the British flotilla. In response, the Native Americans, allied with France, began to raid British frontier settlements in the fall of 1755. The farmers in West Virginia suffered most. The fort garrisons were assigned to protect them, but there was little they could do. All in all, this war caused significant damage to Britain. It became absolutely necessary to either annihilate or achieve reconciliation with the scalp-hunting Native Americans. The 7 Years' War ended in 1762. As a result of the long battles, the French had lost Canada for good. The last attempt to recapture the French colonies was made in summer 1762. A French squadron landed on the island of Newfoundland and was easily able to occupy St. John's, the island's most important city. However, by early September, the English had managed to gather their troops there and forced the French to surrender.